Have you ever wondered when the rapture will occur? When that glorious resurrection will transform our living bodies to that which is fit for eternity? I certainly have, and I have been asked many, many questions over the years whenever I've taught on this topic by individuals who want to know, when will it occur? Well, my name is Grant Jeffrey, and I'm your host of Bible Prophecy Revealed. And in this program, we're going to deal with the topic, when will the rapture occur? There's probably not a more important question that needs to be answered. I know that there are some who have despaired of this particular topic, who have said, well, I'm a pan-tribulationist, that basically they say, I'm not pre-trib, I'm not mid-trib, I'm not post-trib, I'm a pan-trib, meaning it'll all pan out in the end. It's very funny, but it's not realistic, because if you take the Bible seriously, the tribulation is a time of unparalleled horror when the wrath of God is delivered upon unrepentant sinners. It is not a matter of indifference or humor as to whether or not hundreds of millions, perhaps a billion Christians are on earth at this time. If God's teaching is that the church will be taken to glory before the terrible tribulation, certainly that is something we should know about. And it would explain why the Apostle Paul refers to this event as the blessed hope of the church. It would certainly not be a blessed hope if we were going to have to endure and die in the tribulation under the wrath of God. Today we're going to deal with the rapture of the church, and the question is, when will the rapture occur? This has brought about a lot of debate, especially during the last 100 years. Will the rapture, the resurrection that all Christians for thousands of years have longed for, occur at Armageddon after 7 years of the Antichrist and the mark of the beast and all the beheading and all the torture that will go on during that time, as some believe? Or will the rapture occur at the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation, having endured some of the judgments of God, some of the wrath, but escaping the last 3.5 years of the mark of the beast? Or otherwise, will the rapture occur before the tribulation even begins, before the Antichrist makes his 7-year treaty? That position is known as the pre-tribulation position. And it is one that a vast majority of Bible scholars who specialize in the study of prophecy have taught for many, many years, with very good reason. Why is that? Well, let's look at what the Apostle Paul teaches us. The Apostle Paul was very concerned with the topic of the resurrection. And the word rapture that has been derived from it in the last 500 years, in fact, is the hope of the church. It is that moment in which we will receive not only an escape from the Antichrist, which is certainly welcome, but it is the moment that we will be transformed in the twinkling of an eye, that we will receive a resurrection body fit for eternity. Some people have said to me, well, I don't believe in the rapture. And usually I say to them, well, are you saying that you think you're going to go through eternity as a ghost, a disembodied spirit? And they say, well, no, that's not what I mean. I say, well, what do you mean? Usually what they say is that they do not believe in the pre-tribulation rapture, that they believe we will be transformed and receive a resurrection body, but that it will happen at Armageddon when Christ comes to destroy the Antichrist and set up his kingdom. Well, what does Paul teach? In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16 and 17, Paul writes, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, and with the voice of an archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord." Well, let's examine this passage. He tells us that Jesus Christ is going to descend from heaven with a shout. Now, he does not say at this point that he's descending to the earth to defeat the battle of Armageddon and the Antichrist and the false prophet, but rather he comes in the air. And he comes in the air not alone, but all the saints of the departed all those who died in faith in the Old and New Testament, in their spirits, they come with him. The Bible tells us that the bodies of those who die in belief will be resurrected at that moment. That God will take the atoms of the original body, transform them instantaneously into a body that is fit for eternity, that is immortal, incorruptible, a body that we will be just living as real as we are today, will be able to eat and drink, to touch, but a body that is indestructible, incapable of disease or death. Now he tells us that it will happen with the trump of God. And he says, the dead in Christ shall rise first, and then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds. So he comes in the clouds, not to the ground. Now when he comes at Armageddon, it's clear that he comes to the ground. He comes to the earth. He comes to engage in the battle of Armageddon. And he comes not alone, but in fact, millions of resurrected saints will be riding on heavenly horses, according to Revelation 19, and we will be there with him to witness his victory over the Antichrist and the false prophet and their armies. Well, in this event, which is different than his revelation when he comes at Armageddon, he comes in the clouds, and he comes with the spirits of those who've died. Those who are alive and remain, the living generation of believers at that time, they will be transformed into their resurrection body a second after those who've died. All the atoms of those who are in the grave, those who are in the sea, the atoms of the bodies of all Christians and all Old Testament believers will be transformed and will rise in the air supernaturally as Jesus arose on the day of Ascension. They will be joined with their spirit. We who are alive at that time will be transformed while we're still here on the ground on earth. And we in our resurrection body will rise a minute or a second after them, rather, into the air to be with Jesus forever. Now, some people have looked at that statement that says with the trump of God and have imagined that that means at the last trump, which in the book of Revelation is clearly something that takes place toward the end of the 7-year tribulation. And they have said, see, if it's at the trump of God, then it must mean that the rapture takes place toward the end of the tribulation or even at Armageddon. Well, is Paul referring here to the last trump? Well, if I say to you, pick up a chair, it is assumed that any chair will do. I'm not specifically referring to the last of a series of chairs. Paul is writing around 63 AD. John does not receive his revelation until 96 AD, some 30-some years later. So Paul, who died in the 60s, could not possibly be referring to the last trump, which would not be revealed by God by inspiration to John for some 30 years later. The Bible does not refer to something in a series which won't be revealed until 3 decades later. Paul must be referring to a trump that was knowledgeable not only to himself, but to his Jewish Christian readers. What trumps could those be? Well, in Numbers chapter 10, God told the children of Israel that when he gave the signal to Moses and then to Joshua, they were to blow the first of the 2 silver trumpets. Mount up, mount your wagons, get your kids together, pull everything together, be ready. And then at the blowing of the second and last trump, move out. I believe that what Paul was alluding to is that there will be a spiritual awakening in the church some point just before the rapture resurrection takes place. Not that we will know exactly, but there will be an anticipation, a sense, it's coming. And then when the trump is blown, we will rise with Jesus and meet him in the air. It says, then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. This is the promise of the resurrection, the rapture. Its primary purpose is not that we would escape the coming tribulation, although that is a very welcome side benefit of the fact of its timing. Rather, the purpose of the rapture is that at some point in history, we must be transformed. Both the saints who are dead, spirits in heaven, bodies in the ground, and those Christians in that generation which are alive when Jesus actually comes. All of them must receive a resurrection body. The only way they can do it is if there is a rapture that takes place. Now, Paul also tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, 50 and 51, he tells us in the twinkling of an eye it will take place. That it will happen so fast that people will hardly even believe their eyes when they see that Christians have been changed and now rise in the air. The Bible doesn't give us many details, but we know that when Jesus rose in the air, he was actually seen by the disciples and perhaps other people on the Mount of Ascension. And so perhaps those around us who are not Christians will actually watch us physically arise. The Bible doesn't give us the details. Now, there are many who believe that this idea that the rapture resurrection will take place before the tribulation is an idea that is really a Johnny-come-lately. That's an idea that did not exist before. However, I have found that there is some original research that I was able to complete a number of years ago and found a manuscript from the early Christian church which clearly talked about the pre-tribulation rapture. As an example of the suggestion that there was no teaching of the rapture taking place before the tribulation before very recently, a book that was written about 1975 talking about the rapture as a kind of cover-up, I quote, it says, before 1830, Christians had always believed in a single future coming. In other words, Jesus would come only once, not once in the air and then once later to the earth. But this man says there was only one belief. He's coming once, and then he says, and the catching up of 1 Thessalonians 4 that we just read about will take place after the Great Tribulation of Matthew 24. He says that was taught universally until 1830. He's referring to the fact that a man by the name of John Darby of the Plymouth Brethren in 1830 began writing extensively about the pre-tribulation rapture. But I'm going to show you that there were others who clearly saw this more than 1,000 years before John Darby in 1830. Another writer in a book in 1980 wrote, people who are teaching the pre-tribulation rapture are teaching something that was never taught before 1812. Not one of the early church fathers taught a pre-tribulation rapture. Well, let me give you the good news. If it is true, the question will be found in the Bible, not in the opinions of man. If the Bible teaches it, it's true, that settles it for me. But it is significant that if it is a true statement of the Bible, that some Christians at some earlier point than 1830 would have seen it. And I've found more than one who did and wrote extensively about it. This was a writing of a man who's found in the post-Nicene Fathers, that series of early Christian writers. This man was known as Ephraim the Syrian. He lived on the Turkish-Syrian border. This man was a major writer, Christian poet. He wrote songs which are still sung in the Orthodox Greek Church today. He wrote very literally about prophecy. And when I read his writings in the post-Nicene Fathers, I wondered if this man had also seen the truth of the pre-tribulation rapture. I discovered he'd written a book that had never, ever been translated into a modern European language. It was written in Syriac, the language of his day, back in 373 AD, 1,700 years ago. Here's what this man wrote in the book that he called On the Last Times, the Antichrist and the End of the World, by Ephraim the Syrian, dated AD 373. He talked about the rapture, and he said that it was imminent, and he said, and I quote, "We ought to understand thoroughly, therefore, my brothers, what is imminent or overhanging." He says, we must prepare ourselves for the meeting of the Lord, so that he may draw us from the confusion which overwhelms the world. He used the word confusion as a synonym for the tribulation. Here is the quote that I want to draw your attention to. For all the saints and the elect of God are gathered prior to the tribulation that is to come, and are taken to the Lord, lest they see the confusion that is to overwhelm the world because of our sins. If that's not a pre-tribulation statement, I don't know what is. A friend of mine took that statement after I discovered it, and he sent it to a number of theologians and did not tell them where it was originally written. He asked them, what do you make of that statement? These men, though themselves not pre-tribulationists, stated, Well, that's a writing by someone who obviously holds the pre-tribulation rapture position. They were stunned when they found that this was a 1,700-year-old statement from Ephraim the Syrian, proving that the pre-trib rapture is not some late idea, not some new theological notion in the last 2 centuries, but in fact was discovered back in the early centuries of the early Christian church. There are a number of other writers in the 1700s who also talked about it. Joseph Mead, in his book, The Key to Revelation, wrote first and described this event as the rapture. Now, some have complained that the word rapture is not found in the Bible, but Jerome in 385 AD translated, caught up with the Latin word in his Latin translation as rapere, to be caught up, and that word ultimately was translated into a noun in the English, rapture. What are the reasons why we can have confidence that we are going to be raptured before the tribulation and the Antichrist? First of all, in 1 Thessalonians 1:10. In that verse, what do we find? The Apostle Paul, speaking about this very thing to the church at Thessalonica, says the following: "We are to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, which delivered us from the wrath to come." 1 Thessalonians 1:10. Now listen to the sequence. We're to wait for his Son from heaven. That's the rapture, a future event. Whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus. And then he says, which delivered us from the wrath to come. So a future event, Christ coming for us in the air, will deliver us from a yet more future event, the wrath to come. Now the wrath to come is clearly the tribulation wrath of God. In Revelation chapter 6, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse begin the 7-year tribulation period. Those 4 things that are involved in the 4 horsemen: the 2nd horseman of war, the 3rd horseman of famine, the 4th horseman of plague and wild beast attacking mankind. Those 4 things are called in the prophet Ezekiel in multiple places in the Old Testament, over a dozen times. They're called God's 4 severe judgments, the wrath of God. It's clear this is the wrath of God. And in 1 Thessalonians 5:9, the Apostle Paul tells us clearly that God has not appointed us unto wrath, but unto salvation. You can examine the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single instance where God has ever once poured his wrath upon the righteous. Even in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Abraham argued with God and said, well, if there be 50 righteous men there, or if there be 40, if there be 30, and there weren't even 10. But Abraham said, shall not the God of all the earth do right? In other words, he challenged God that he would not destroy the righteous with the unrighteous. And the angels said to Lot, when they came into the city, you and your family must leave, because until you leave, we cannot destroy this wicked city. God never indiscriminately destroys the righteous with the unrighteous. If the righteous were still on earth, then the wrath of God of Revelation could not be poured out, because it goes 1/3 of all the vegetation is destroyed, 1/3 of the waters are turned to blood. This would obviously destroy the 500 to 1 billion righteous Christians throughout the world. Also, when we look, we find that in Revelation 7:1-8, God supernaturally causes the angel to seal for divine protection 144,000 righteous Jews. Now, 2 chapters later, in chapter 9, the satanic locusts are released from the bottomless pit, and they sting everybody on earth except the 144,000 who have the seal of God. They are stung so that they wish they could die, but they think about this logically. There's 144,000 Jews, 12,000 from each tribe, supernaturally sealed for divine protection on earth. Then everyone else is stung by demonic locusts for 5 months and wish they could die. Where are the Christians? We are not the 144,000 righteous Jews. We cannot be stung by demonic locusts, because we are the servants of God. We are protected by God. We obviously are no longer on earth at that time. Logically, therefore, for this and a multitude of other reasons, we can have confidence that God's purpose is not that the church will live through the tribulation. When God takes his church home to glory, he tells us clearly, He is going to deal with Israel. He's going to deal with the nations. And we will be at the marriage supper of the Lamb. Of all the topics I teach, the topic of the timing of the rapture arouses more questions and occasionally even animosity. Those who do not believe in the timing of the pre-tribulation rapture sometimes feel almost an anger and believe that you are really saying that the church is somehow going to escape the tribulation and the turmoil that so many Christians in the last 2,000 years have had to endure. But that is a misunderstanding. Jesus Christ does not promise the church an escape from tribulation. In fact, as anyone who studies history and current events knows, that the church is under tremendous tribulation today. People are being crucified in various countries around the world because they're Christians. And so it is quite possible, if God tarries, that the church will endure tribulation. But the question is this: will we endure the great tribulation in that 7-year period of the wrath of God? And here we're going to find that the answer is no. Among the questions that I have received regarding the time of the rapture, one of my favorites is, what is the real meaning of the expression, the falling away, that is found in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3? Let me just read that to you. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, and he's talking about the Antichrist, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Here this verse, at first glance, reading the King James Version and many others, seems to say that there's going to be a great apostasy, a falling away prior to the time of the Antichrist appearing. But that is not what it actually says. The Greek word that is translated in the King James, apostasia, translated as falling away, and has been translated so by some others, is not the only possible translation. In fact, it is not even the most natural translation. Theologians and Bible scholars have looked at this word apostasia, that is translated falling away in our King James Version, and have discovered that in every one of the English versions of the Bible, from about Wycliffe all the way up until 2 years before the King James Bible, without fail, 9 different versions translated that as departure away first. So let me just read it as the early translations read it. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a departure away first, and then the man of sin be revealed. What that would be saying is, there's going to be a departure away of a group of people. Well, that sounds a lot like the rapture to me. Remember this, the people at Thessalonica have been taught by Paul about the rapture. They've now been confused about the rapture, and now he's trying to straighten them out. Now, when he says departure away first, he uses the Greek article for the. He's referring to a departure that they know about. If I tell you, pick up the chair, the implication is there's a series of chairs of which one, you and I both know, is the chair I want you to pick up. I believe that it's very clear that Paul is here saying in one of the most clear pre-tribulation verses that the departure away first will occur of people being taken away from the earth by an external force, being the rapture, is what is being referred to. Another question that has appeared when I talk about the rapture is, what is the significance of John's vision of the 24 elders with crowns relative to the timing of the rapture? Well, the answer to this is that John is taken up in sequence in Revelation 4 to heaven after seeing the vision of the 7 letters to the churches. Now he's taken into the future, and he sees the 24 elders with crowns. Now, everything that happens in the tribulation from chapter 6 on is the great tribulation. It begins with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The wrath of God is poured out upon unrepentant sinners from chapter 4 all the way to chapter 19. Significantly, We do not see the church mentioned as being on earth one time, not once, from chapter 4 to 19 that deals with the tribulation and the wrath of God. Rather, the fact that John in chapter 4, before this ever even begins, sees the elders with crowns, they represent the church in heaven. Nobody gets a crown until the rapture. Let me give you what Paul also clearly wrote in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them that hath love of his appearing. Paul tells us that God has set aside a day when he's going to give the crown of righteousness to all those who love his appearing. Now, if everyone's going to get it who loves his appearing, then that includes people who are alive right up until the day of the rapture. If John in Revelation 4, before the wrath of God and the tribulation is even described, sees the 24 elders wearing their crowns, then logically the rapture has already taken place in time. When you examine this, I think it's very clear that what God is saying is he's going to take his church home to glory. He's going to give us the crowns and rewards at the judgment seat of Christ that is promised in Romans. And then we're going to partake in the marriage supper of the Lamb described in Revelation 18. In order to eat and drink, we have to have a body. In order to wear the crown, you must have a body. You cannot wear it as a disembodied spirit or ghost. And so the rapture must already have taken place for us to be judged and receive crowns and to eat and drink at the marriage supper. The very next chapter, 19, John describes the church with Jesus Christ riding white horses from heaven, wearing robes of white, representing the righteousness of the saints, descending to earth to witness Christ's victory over the Antichrist in the Battle of Armageddon. The sequence is clear, my friend. Jesus Christ is going to rapture his church home to glory, and then we will return with him 7 or so years later to this earth.